Hello YouTube, my name is Zach, and today I have a little bit of a surprise. I have another Patreon request from Alina. Thank you so much, Alina, for the support. I'm going to be analyzing Vulfpeck, and I know that that's probably not at all what some of you have expected of this channel, since I mostly focus on, rock singers, and sometimes I'll branch out into like indie or alternative type stuff. But Vulfpeck is a little bit of a different breed, and I had not really listened to them very much. I still haven't listened to them a ton, but I know that they're mostly an instrumental group that focuses on funk and R&B and soul and things like that. And so this particular analysis is going to be of the song Aunt Leslie. And, I had only listened to this a couple of times prior to this recording, so I'm familiarizing myself with their sound, but there's a lot that I think you all will glean from my analysis today, because the approach to singing here is going to be very different from what we've seen in some of the prior videos with a lot of the rock and the metal guys. The singer's name is Antwaun Stanley, and he has a classical singing background, actually. I did a little bit of research on him to kind of understand sort of where he's coming from and what his philosophies were. And he actually took an interest in classical music out of high school and went to college in order to study the voice and to study classical singing, and then broke off into his own sort of R&B gospel soul type thing. About 2 years into college, he released an EP and it got pretty popular, so he took a break from college and went to pursue his solo singing career, and here it is. Now he's getting gigs with all sorts of bands and he's performing all over the place. I think he maybe performed at like a presidential ceremony of some kind, like in 2013 or something. I mean, he's been all over the place when it comes to singing at major events, so he's starting to develop quite a name for himself. So that just gives you all a little bit of his background in case you've never heard of him. I know that since a lot of you are rock and metal fans, you probably don't pay attention to the R&B/gospel side of things very much, and so it's definitely worth branching out, because you're going to see that through this analysis there are some elements of his singing style that you're not going to hear as much in metal, and so you'll be able to hear kind of the other side of the fence with regards to how someone approaches this style and how some of the habits, good and bad, pop up differently than typically does in your rock or metal singer. And for those of you who've never seen my videos before, this is an objective analysis. When I talk about my analyses, my observations, and my critiques, I'm always coming at them from the approach of vocal health and what kind of vocal habits and methods are healthy and sustainable for your voice. What kind of things will damage the mechanism in the long run? What kind of things are good for the mechanism in the long run? So if you ever wonder how I come to the conclusions that I do, the fundamental basis of all of it is in vocal health. So without further ado, let's get started. This is Aunt Leslie by Vulfpeck, featuring Antwaun Stanley.
You were the lens I used to see, sharpen the view, the news, the color TV.
So immediately, you probably already see some very different technical fundamentals. One of the core facets of the singing style as a whole that you tend to hear is a very heavy reliance upon the low head voice, the light, heady, falsetto kind of sound. And in this case, you can definitely hear Antwaun leaning on that a lot in these vocal melodies. Now, another element of the gospel/R&B style is you get extremely wide embouchures. So if you go back and watch again, you'll see that his embouchures are very wide open. He kind of does this almost like square shape with his mouth and his teeth when he sings, and typically that's indicative of strain. And so one of the common threads you're going to see in this analysis is that he does have facial tension and strain, and he also places a lot of the resonance in his nose. Now, the nasal thing is pretty common in gospel and R&B. You hear that a lot. It's almost like a byproduct of the sound. And so it's important to point out that when you talk about placing the sound in the nose and nasal resonance, we're not necessarily dealing with health in the same way that we're talking about placement. So sometimes you can place things, place sounds, place resonance in unnatural places in the mouth or in the nose or in the throat or whatever. And it isn't necessarily unhealthy, but it is inefficient. A lot of times the improper placement in terms of like unusual placement of sound brings other bad habits along with it. So be paying attention to that and be mindful and listening for the sounds that he creates that sound very nasal. They sound very buzzy, kind of like this. If they have that kind of affect to it, pay attention to it, because I'll probably be honing in on that specific sound and the way that it affects the singing as it comes across.
Filter the truth through you to me.
So yeah, right here, you can hear him. Well, he was on the word me, and you can me. You can really hear that buzzy nasal thing. You can even see this kind of buildup of tension in the middle of his forehead, and the nose is kind of pushing upward. And what that is him just pushing the resonance into his nose, lifting the top lip up. Kind of can have that same effect too. It makes the resonance very frontal, very buzzy, very nasal. And so out of this, the number one thing that I would say is unhealthy or not good for the mechanism as a whole is the tension. The tension is just causing muscles to work when they don't need to. One of the biggest questions I get is like, how do you distinguish someone creating facial tension from someone being expressive? The truth of it is that there is a very clear difference between someone expressing things with their face or, like trying to get a point across the way they look and tensing up because they're trying to sing something. There's a big difference. So if you look at this, you can see that with his eyes being this closed, his lip being up, his nose being raised, and the forehead coming in, there's this buildup. It's almost like centralized right here where all that tension, kind of in like the sinus area, all that tension is kind of pushing together and being combined. And that's a very common thing in this style. I would say that one of the most destructive elements of gospel and R&B type singing is that there's so much extraneous tension put in the face to create the sound. That and extremely wide embouchures. If you ever listen to like gospel, you'll hear very wide embouchures, just like really wide open kind of stuff. You hear that a lot. And that typically leads to some pretty destructive vocal habits. You're not quite going to hear that as much in this particular song, but it's important to point out since he does admittedly have a big time background in gospel singing. So you can kind of know that that's sort of the idiom from which he pulls these habits.
What's not to trust is just your family.
Very, very nice transition up into that head voice. That is another hallmark of the R&B thing you're going to hear a lot. That style, they're usually extremely good at navigating from the chest voice or the modal register into the head voice / falsetto sound. So here you see a very clean upward motion into the falsetto, and he navigates it very well. The only thing that I would hear in this little section that would be worthy of critique in any way is that some of his modal sound, his chest sound, has too much air going through it. That's another characteristic of R&B and gospel. Well, not so much gospel, mostly R&B singing. It's very common in the R&B style for them to cover their sound with air, push too much air through the folds. And if you've never seen a video before, I'll quickly explain it. You have two phases of vocal fold phonation. You got the adduct phase and the abduct phase. And so throughout that process of the chords vibrating, you want them to fully close. And so if there's air passing through the glottis or the point where the folds touch, then the folds don't fully close and different parts of the mechanism take too much work. And if those parts of the mechanism take too much work, then eventually they become, overworked. And after that overwork happens, then they'll end up compensating by developing polyps or nodules. And this is something that takes time. I mean, singing with a little extra air through the folds is not going to cause nodules day one. But if it's something you make a habit out of and you do every day for a year, you might start running into some vocal injury issues. And typically you don't want to see that kind of thing. It's very common in pop singers. Adele and John Mayer are two people that I always refer back to as being hallmark examples of people who use that extra air and it's caused them vocal damage over time. So a couple of things to point out here that really don't have anything necessarily to do with Antwaun singing specifically, but more to the harmonies here. You can hear how they're both in tune, but they don't quite lock in harmonically. Now, there are a couple of reasons for this. When you listen to a group of singers that are perfectly in tune, you hear overtones. You hear this very bright, shiny, ringy sound that's like octaves above the harmony that's being created. And not only do the two notes when you sing have to be in tune for that to happen, they have to have similar timbre characteristics. And so some of the things that you will do to help mold those timbre similarities is like shaping of your embouchure or your lip shaping, making sure your vowels are the same, making sure the volumes are balanced between the notes being sung. Those kinds of things tend to lead to proper tuning that allow for overtones. And you can even see here on the word that they're singing, that you can tell that they're singing. Just look at their mouths. Look at the shape of their mouths. You can see they're singing the same word, but their lip shapes are very different. And even though that might not seem like it's very relevant, in harmony, if you want perfectly in tune harmony, your lip shapings need to be extremely similar. And so that's just something to point out here that you can actually work on yourself if you're trying to harmonize, even harmonizing with yourself if you're recording. Make sure that all those elements of the sound are the same. Make sure that the balance is the same, the volumes are the same. Make sure that your lip shapings are the same. Those kinds of things go toward the concept of blend, and blend is what creates that overtone concept that makes harmony seem so rich and amazing sounding. And this is a quick example of what a perfectly in tune chord sounds like so that you can kind of hear it. Okay, so it didn't show his face here, so I can't really do an analysis like I want to of it, but I just want to point out real quick before we move on and he does it some more. That run, da-da-da-da-da, whatever it was, whatever the notes were, that is what is called a melisma. Now, I've heard all over the internet since I got on YouTube all these different words and names for what that is. I've heard everything from the word riffing to running, like singing runs, like all that kind of stuff. Honestly, I'm an old whippersnapper, and I go back to what I learned in college and academic settings. It's called a melisma. That's what it's been called for 400 years, so I'm going to stick with that for now. I've heard so many different, like, sub-definitions of riffs and runs and things that I don't really want to bother with getting it wrong. So I'm just going to call them melismas. And so he does a very good job of navigating the melisma. The melisma itself is when you have multiple notes on a single syllable or a single vowel. And that's when you hear that, that's when you know that it's a melisma. Beyonce does it a lot. Actually, you hear it a ton in Bach music, early Baroque music. You hear a ton of melisma. Pop music tends to really lean on the whole melisma thing a lot. And so what makes a melisma good is a good sense of legato. So if I went, or something like that, whatever, any little 5-note grouping, the melisma is most effective when I connect the line of sound together from the beginning to the end. So, for example, if I did a bad melisma, it would be like, ah ha 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 ha. You would hear that ha 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 that goes in between each note, and it kind of stops the fluidity of it. But if I take that H out of it and I make it legato, you can hear the motion moves much more fluidly. It almost has this like connection in the sound. And so as I've talked about in the past, legato is a massively important element of singing across genres. It doesn't really matter what genre of music you're talking about, whether it be rock, metal, pop, country, classical, R&B. Legato is a consistently important concept to work on in your singing technique in and of itself because it can be applied just about everywhere, melisma included.
I blew out and tried to make it right.
Okay, so stopping again here. All those movements into head voice are full falsetto. So I know that there's a lot of confusion around mixed voice, head voice, falsetto, all that kind of stuff. Just know that that sound that he made, it almost has like a for a lack of a better word, like a feminine quality to the sound. That's a full falsetto sound. When it starts carrying on the chestier, thicker sound, when you move into that head voice sound, that's when it becomes a mix. But when you hear that like very almost feminine quality of sound, that's when it becomes a full falsetto for men. Just to give you a distinction of kind of what a falsetto, a pure falsetto sounds like.
That's when Leon...
Yeah, so you can hear that nasal thing coming through. Just want to point that out. That's another example. And if you looked at his face did this thing again. It kind of like it's pulled inward, like squinched inward. That's a very, very clear example of what nasal resonance can do when you really push the sound into the nose.
Amen to rain, yeah.
Now, I got to give it to the guy. I mean, he's got an amazing degree of control. His intonation is flawless, and I don't think this is pitch corrected or auto-tuned. And if it is, it's very, very minor. So I mean, it's got some reverb on it. It's clearly been processed a little bit, but I don't think that it's auto-tuned just because of how fluidly he moves from pitch, and it doesn't have any sounds like artifacts or anything on it that make me think that it's been digitally edited too much. He's got a magnificent sense of control, and he's got incredible intonation, and his legato is on point. So all these technical elements I'm talking about don't necessarily take away from his ability to sing, and it's important to bring up the point that having like suboptimal technique does not make you a bad singer. And that's a big distinction that's really important that needs to be made. You can use things that in the classical bel canto whatever sense are, poor technique if it gets the artistic goal across that you want. And I think that that's an idea that people get conflated in my channel a lot, is that, by me saying you're doing technical things that aren't optimal, you're doing something that makes you a bad singer, when it's really not that at all. Being able to manage these things is just as difficult, even if the technique is suboptimal. Using optimal technique where you have perfect legato, perfectly placed resonance, perfect breath support, all these things are a challenge in and of themselves, but it doesn't mean that him singing in this way isn't difficult and have its own set of, skills to build and challenges and whatnot. So I just want to point that out.
What have you sown? What have you done with
So, gosh, I have so much to say about this. I know this looks like a reaction video, but it's not. I got the same kind of vibe when I listened to it the first time when I went through this video. It's really interesting to me how so much of the singing up to this point is very and then he does this really back of mouth open resonance. Almost, it's not classical or operatic, but it almost has that opera position on the throat thing going on. And there's this amazing legato that carries all the way through the phrase, and you can hear it all consistent. And it's just really interesting to me, and it shows that that his skill set, that Antwaun's skill set, is very diverse. You can hear his classical background come through in this very well. So I want to go back and listen to this one little section again. I'm going to play it back, but I just wanted to point out that if you want to get the reaction video side of things a little bit, that's it's striking to me how well-rounded his singing technique is. So it goes back to that whole concept of when you have suboptimal technique, sometimes it's just a choice you're making, and you're trying to make those sounds that aren't technically optimal for the artistic reason. And as long as you've got a fundamentally sound bass and a background you can go to, then there's really nothing wrong with that. And that's kind of what you're seeing here. So I'm going to go back and play this again so I can actually analyze what he's doing a little bit.
What have you sown? What have you done with Leo?
So on the what have you done part, he kind of had this wah, wah, wah kind of thing going on. And in a sense, it almost sounds a little bit the pendulum swung too far this way with the opera stuff. If I were singing that line, what have you done, or whatever the word is, I don't know what the words are, but however it goes, that's the melody. I wouldn't go, what have you done? It's just too stiff. And one of the big misconceptions about classical singing and opera singing is that it all has to be super stiff, but it's not. You don't have to be stiff to make that sound. And so I think while he's trying to create that style and that sound, I think that it's a little overboard for the way that the sound is created. It doesn't have to be so rigid. However, on the next part, when he does the melisma, when he kind of carries the sound of this melismatic thing, it gets very legato, very free sounding, very even. So, there could be an artistic reason within the text that he's doing this, but that's one of those things that I can't interpret because I'm not in his head, and I can't tell you he's making this sound for this artistic reason. I can say that since he's shown an aptitude and a propensity to make artistic decisions with his singing, there is the possibility that he's making this very rigid sound for an artistic purpose, but I can't tell you what that is. I mean, that's only the artist can tell you that, right?
What have you sown?
So here on the word sold, it's there's this there's this really sort of closed thing going on, and I feel like he could have sung this more efficiently without all that facial tightness if he turned the vowel more open instead of and now I'm not a tenor, so it's probably not going to sound that great. But oh, you could just open things up a little bit more and not have them so pinched off, and it might have a little bit more of a full sound. If you sing with that much push and that much closure in the back of the throat, eventually your vocal mechanism is going to get very tired from that. So part of the reason you open up when you make higher notes is to sort of allow the vocal tract to sort of shape the way that it wants to keep the folds vibrating. So if you do too much to get in the muscles' way, it makes them overwork. So I would say that if you're going to sing something up that high, you want to open up a little bit more rather than shut everything down and close. That's typically not a great way to phonate when you're upper range.
What have you done with me?
So yeah, when he opened up to that E vowel, you could see his teeth doing that thing. Really, it's unnecessary because you can make an E sound without doing that with your mouth. So you like E, and you can keep the pitch exactly the same. So you don't have to open your mouth that wide. And that's part of that gospel influence I was talking about. You see that all the time when you watch gospel singers. Their embouchures, just their lip shape just gets so wide open when it doesn't really have to be. It's just extra muscle engagement. I go back to that a lot, but why engage the muscles when you don't have to? I mean, it's not really adding any degree of expressiveness that wouldn't be there if his mouth were more closed. He could still do his little like scrunchy thing if that, I don't believe this, but if that were his like expressive thing, he could still do that without opening the lips that wide. You don't have to do that. And so since you don't have to, why should you? And I've yet to see a convincing argument from anybody as to why, because opening the lips more doesn't change the process of phonation at all. All the sound's already been made. The sound's being shaped by the vocal tract. So once it reaches the lips, the sound's already coming out of the mouth. So what purpose does widening the embouchures that much have? I mean, just some food for thought. Now that was an absolutely splendid example of navigating from the head voice into the modal register, up through the mix, back into the head voice, and back down to the modal register. That takes a degree of control that is absolutely unparalleled. I mean, I have students, and you know who you are out there, who've been working on navigating that mixed voice, moving through that mix thing for months. It took me years to get to the point where I could just move in and out of the mix without having a lot of effort in it. So the fact that he's able to navigate those scale patterns up and down, in and out of the head voice, in and out of the mix like that, and keep that tonal consistency and the legato, it shows incredible skill. It shows great support. It shows a wonderful concept of legato. Whoever taught this guy to sing, whoever his voice teachers were when he studied, really emphasized legato to him, and it shows. It pays off. When someone has that connectedness in their sound, it gives their singing this fluidity and this elegance about it that it transcends style. And so there's so much good to say about that. I could go on about that for 10 minutes. How he modified his vowels. His embouchure stayed consistent up and down, even though he was doing vowel modifications. I mean, I can go on about that for a while, but I would rather not bore you guys with all that stuff. Point being, incredibly consistent, excellent delivery of the line, technically very sound, very solid, and that could convert into any style of music. Not opera, because typically when people sing opera, they're not using full head voice that much, and the mix is a very kind of iffy thing as to whether or not people are actually mixing on some of those high notes. But for everything other than opera, I would say that singing sound could fit anywhere. Excellent, excellent stuff. So here we've gotten the harmonies, this really aspirate thing going through. It's just like I said at the beginning, you really shouldn't be doing that a lot. If you're going to be doing the aspirate thing where you push air through and you don't let the folds fully close, do that at a minimum, because if you do that a lot, you will end up getting vocal issues. I mean, that isn't an if, that's a when type thing. If you keep your folds from closing when they phonate, it will damage them. It's just a matter of time. And no one is exempt to this. It doesn't matter who you are. And that's why one of the core facets of getting voice training, and it should be for you as well, is creating a clear sound that's on the voice. On the voice means that it doesn't have extra air going through it. So if you have a voice teacher that's like encouraging you to sing in a breathy way, you need to seriously consider going to another teacher, because that's not a sustainable method of singing. So that was really it. I mean, there was more harmonies of the same thing at the end, but it'll be redundant just for me to go back and analyze the same thing. But yeah, I'm super impressed by this guy's voice. He has a lot of skill, and I'm most impressed by the versatility and how diverse he was able to use his voice. And even though his like opera sounding stuff didn't quite fit that classical idiom 100%, he still did a really good job of navigating the different vocal colors that are required to sing in these various styles. So really great work in that regard. A little bit of facial tension, a little bit extraneous facial tension for my taste, a little bit too much nasal resonance in terms of like something that's sustainable, and occasionally he had a propensity to put too much air over his sound. But other than that, it sounded like he had an excellent sense of control with his voice, and he clearly had some fundamental training, or else he wouldn't be able to have such a ridiculously good legato sound throughout his singing. So that's really it. I hope that you all enjoyed it, and I hope that you learned something. I know that I touched on some topics that I don't really delve into a whole lot, but I mean, that's what happens when you go into other styles, and that's one reason that I don't want to just stick in the metal all the time, because there's things to learn from all sorts of genres of music: classical, rock, pop, everything. You can learn something from every genre. It doesn't matter. So you can expect some different genres coming down the pipe soon too. And I've been reluctant to really hit on some of these big guys like D-Mash and Brandon Urie and all those people. I'm not trying to follow trends, and I will inevitably analyze those people, but I kind of want to wait until the wave dies down so that I don't get an angry mob of fans like attacking me and calling me a whatever and a stupid beef. Like I've gotten some really interesting insults since I started this channel, so I want to stay away from that for the time being. Anyway, that's it. I do have a Patreon, and if you want to do a request, then at the $10 tier on my Patreon, you get to choose a topic. It can be anything involving singing or an analysis of a specific singer. It's totally up to you, within reason. There's certain things I won't talk about, but for the most part, I'll talk about any subject. I also do give voice lessons. I will put a link to my booking client down in the description and in the comments, so feel free to hit me up if you're interested in voice lessons. And that's it. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will see you all next week. Take care. Bye.